The final technical inspection is going on at the military aircraft. A huge 4-engine bomber with red stars on its wings is ready for takeoff. It has no bombs on board. The route is laid to the west. The objective of the flight is kept in secret. The crew doesn't even know who is going to be the passenger of this extraordinary flight. Everybody is ready, but they are still not cleared for takeoff. Finally, the car enters the airfield and the passenger comes to the plane. The passenger is a personal representative of Stalin, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the USSR, Vyacheslav Molotov. Only several people in the whole country knew about his participation in this trip. The engines roared and the bombers heavily climbed into the sky and headed in the direction of the front line. This is how one of the most secret flights of the Second World War began. Its destination was Great Britain, then the United States of America. This flight determined the destiny of the whole world in the war. Today we know the details of this deathful flight thanks only to the diary of one person. It was Endel Pusep, the aircraft commander. The details of the flight, which they might never come back home from.
The venture was extremely risky, and they all realized it. The Nazis knew about the flight, they prepared for it, and tried to abort the flight. Even Josef Vissarionovich, Stalin, dared to fly to Tehran after him.
They take off at night. It's safer this way. A clouded sky is in their favor as well. 20,000 kilometers of a highly risky trip lie ahead. It's going to be a hard day's long flight. The first landing is only planned for Great Britain, and right now they have to cross the front line unnoticed. Air defense projectors break their way even through the clouds. They search the sky at random, but sometimes the cabin gets lit as brightly as in the daytime. Anti-aircraft guns bang somewhere below. The pilots know these are still Soviet guns. However, it doesn't help. They can shoot their plane down just as well.
The planes were really secret, and we did not know each other. We did not know the configuration of our planes as well. We just did not know that, especially as for the heavy planes, the fighters.
The first Soviet high-speed bomber, TB-7, renamed as T-8 afterwards, was delivered right before the war. In terms of speed and altitude capacity, it was the best aircraft of its time in the world. It was exactly the plane which was required for this long-distance trip in May 1942. Such a strong and sound machine it was. The TB-7 crew turned northwest from Kalinin and crossed the front line near Veliki Luki. Tension is growing. They flew over the occupied territory. German fighters may attack them at any moment. The achievements of the wintertime have already been left far behind by spring 1942. The Red Army has given away Kerch and the Kerch Peninsula. Enemy troops have started a massive advance. There is a real threat that German troops might break to the Caucasus, to the oil deposits. The situation at the front is as tensed as in summer. Opening a second front is a burning issue and requires urgent solution. For the first time after the beginning of the war, the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain are ready to act as political allies. The negotiations have been carried out as long as half a year, but the controversies between the allies are still too big. They cannot be discussed and eliminated through correspondence. The main political task needs to be solved in order to sign a treaty of alliance with Great Britain and the United States. The main political task needs to be solved in order to sign a treaty of alliance with Great Britain and the USA. Direct negotiations are required for this purpose, first in London and then at the White House. Stalin is willing to conduct these negotiations by himself. President Roosevelt is the first to express doubt about it. Unfortunately, the geographical distance makes it impossible for us to meet at present.
The fact that he really considered the possibility of flying to Great Britain and the United States of America in order to conduct negotiations about the forthcoming opening of the second front showed the situation to be extremely alarming.
However, the flight of the head of the state across the front line was extremely dangerous. Besides, Stalin had never traveled by plane before. The risk was too big. In the end of April, he announces the name of his authorized representative. The Soviet government decided to send Vyacheslav Molotov to London to solve all problems impeding the conclusion of treaties. The commander of the Long-Range Air Force, Major General Alexander Golovanov, is urgently called to the Kremlin. Stalin entrusts him with the preparation for the flight of the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Molotov, to England and the USA, adding weightily that only 3 people in the whole world should know about that. Golovanov realizes the level of responsibility of the task set for him and the complicity of the route. He chooses Polar pilots to become members of the crew. Only these pilots have a unique experience of extra-long flights under extreme conditions. Mayor Endel Pusip is appointed the commander of the crew.
Such a young man was entrusted with such a responsible flight. It always seemed like he has been a mature man, but in 1942, he was just, let me count, 32.
The secret aircraft has been in the air for up to 4 hours already. Over the Baltic states, the plane gets into heavy clouds and is caught by a terrible, disastrous storm. They can't avoid it or descend because their enemy is right below. The commander can't risk the security of the People's Commissar.
The trouble was that we had only meteorological data for our territory. The meteorological data of the Germans, as well as ours, were kept secret, just like operational information.
Even highly experienced pilots feel scared in the heart of the storm. Later on, Pusip will write in his diary, "Lightning seems to beat right into the plane. The aircraft is tossed about. The pilots know that their lives depend on if it survives the blow. The control wheel dances in one's hands, and it feels like a 60-kilogram load." Pusip cries out to the second pilot, "Help me, I can't cope with it by myself." They try to make the plane climb up. They give a command for everybody to put on oxygen masks urgently.
Up to a particular altitude, about 4,500 meters, a healthy person can normally remain conscious. Above this limit, more than 60% of people faint away because of lack of oxygen to feed the brain. There were people on board who, so to say, looked after them. They had a doctor and airman beside. Their responsibility was to watch if the mask is put on properly, if it fits tight, and if there is required pressure in oxygen cylinders.
In its struggle with the storm, the plane loses up to 4,000 meters in altitude. There was only one consolation in it. The heavy curtain of clouds made them invisible for German fighters. Experts affirm that in those times, in the beginning of the 1940s, no aircraft in the world could survive such a storm. But the TB-7 of Mayor Pusip managed it. They don't know what's lying ahead, though. These miraculously saved shots show us the Polar pilots, Endel Pusip and his faithful friend, navigator Alexander Stepenko, the 2 crew members who helped Molotov to cross the ocean. Here they are preparing for an ice reconnaissance mission within their ordinary day's duty, together with the hero of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Vodopyanov. The day of taking the shot is remarkable. Only in 12 hours, on their way home to Igarka, they will get to know about the war started. Being on the northern sea route, they had an exemption from active duty. But no later than on the night of June 22nd, they will be on their way to Moscow. They will strive for instant departure to the front line, and they will get it. Within a short term, a new 81st Long-Range Air Force Division will be formed under the command of Vodopyanov. By a special order, the Polar civil pilots, the navigators, and the engineers will be assigned to the division. There will be some subordination problems in the Vodopyanov division at first, though. It will even get the name of a wild division accordingly.
I heard some stories from the pilots of this division. He used to greet them loudly, "Hi guys," when making them keep the line. And they shouted back to him, "Hi Misha," something like that.
In the beginning of the war, the Vodopyanov's division suffered great losses. The frontline Air Force was insufficient, and the headquarters sent long-range Air Force formations to perform bombing raids on tactical targets in the nearest enemy's rear.
These were the best crews, and they got crashed when bombing Guderian's tanks. Because their task was not to bomb Danzig, or Königsberg, or Berlin, but to stop these clanging avalanches of German tanks going to Moscow, Kiev, and Leningrad.
By midnight, they've covered only half of the distance. 5 more hours of flight still separate them from England. They reach the Baltic Sea. They're flying over the enemy's Baltic fortified localities. They try to be quiet, without giving themselves away in strict radio silence.
They could encounter the enemy at any moment of the flight and be eliminated, as they didn't have any shelter.
Molotov had tough instructions in case of unforeseen circumstances.
He had weapons on him. They provided for the situation of having to defend themselves. The alternatives did not exclude a possibility of landing in the hostile territory or crashing in the air, when they will have a parachute. Evidently, in such a case, the intention was to prevent getting to the enemy alive.
At the altitude of 6,000 meters, he saw the sky full of stars. The aircraft started gaining speed and leaving the battlefields of Europe behind. Somewhere below them, the lights of peaceful Sweden were shining brightly through the holes in the clouds. For Endel Pusip, the war began 9 months ago with the same view of the illuminated city. These were the lights of Berlin, not hidden by the blackout. On the night of August 10th, 1941, Pusip, as a member of the Vodopianov division, got a task to bomb Berlin. It was his first combat flight. They made their way from Leningrad to Berlin, at first over the front line, then over massive barrage force of anti-aircraft guns in the territory of Poland and the western part of the USSR. Happy is the pilot who can be confident in his aircraft. But the pilots on their missions to bomb Berlin on that night didn't have such confidence. In the early days of the war, the problem of the TB-7s was they were newly constructed and transferred to the front without proper testing. Emergencies occurred very often. In the beginning of the war, the TB-7 breakdown rate was enormous.
It was an excellent plane. It was every bit as good as the American B-17, called a Flying Fortress. However, TB-7s had one big problem: engines. The engines failed at an enormous rate, especially at high altitude.
On the night of August 10th, only 6 out of 10 aircraft which took off in Leningrad reached Berlin. They completed their mission, dropped their load of bombs, and turned back. Still, only 2 of the planes landed on the airfield in Leningrad. The rest were shot down, crashed in an accident, or got missing. The plane of the division commander, Vodopianov, where Pusip was the second pilot, didn't come back from this combat mission either. At first, the engine failed, and then the fuel tank was hit by a splinter. It was clear that they would not be able to make it to the home airfield. At 5 a.m., Vodopianov landed the plane on a wood in Estonia. Thus, unwittingly, for the first time, Pusip found himself in his motherland. But the fact that he was Estonian saved the lives of all members of the crew that night.
Although he was born in Siberia and had never been to Estonia before, he spoke Estonian very well, and he managed to lead the crew, mostly with the help of the local boys he talked to the unoccupied territory.
They had already been bemoaned as they had been missing for several days, but suddenly he came back. He crawled back as his spine was injured. This trauma remained for all of his life.
Endel Pusip comes from a family of Estonian peasants living in Siberia. In the end of the 19th century, his grandparents, together with many other Estonian families, covered huge distances over the Russian land to come to the remote regions of Siberia. They settled near Krasnoyarsk, built houses, and started living in a liberal Estonian community. In a few years, the self-acquisition of land was revealed, but the Russian Tsar granted them forgiveness. The land was legalized. The settlement got the name of Samovolny and was charged with taxes. When Endel was 10, an extraordinary event occurred. A plane landed near their settlement. The young and old rushed to look at the wonder. Suddenly, the pilot asked the little boy, "Who would you like to become?" "A pilot." Endel Pusep was born in 1910. At the age of 17, he added himself a year in order to be accepted to the pilot school. Since then, all personal files of Endel Pusep stated the wrong year of birth. For all of his life, Pusep spelled his melodious Estonian surname incorrectly as well, making it Pusep in the Russian short manner. They came by Denmark. Over the North Sea, everybody respired, as the battlefields were left behind. Now they could go on the air for a radio contact again. Scotland responded. Friendly, fair weather was waiting ahead. The plane started descending. Here's the landing runway. It's the first stop after a 10-hour trip, Dundee Airport. Here are the shots from British Chronicles. Molotov is going down the boarding bridge in his high fur boots and a flying helmet. Scottish Small Arms Command salutes the Russian delegation on the airfield with present arms. The Russians' arrival excites a real pilgrimage among the officers of all surrounding military units. They have to post security guards around the plane on the military airfield. The delegation and the crew go to London, to the embassy, by train. But the trip to the British capital was not joyful for the commander and the navigator. A month ago, they had traveled to London in a similar carriage.
Did you know that before the flight, two crews had been formed? One of them was headed by Endel Pusep, and another one by another person, another crew commander. And they flew to London without Molotov at first. A training flight was scheduled in order to test the possibility of the flight to Great Britain first, and only then to take the People's Commissar on board. The responsibility for the flight was entrusted to Asimov. Pusep was appointed the second pilot.
The pilots were not informed about the objective of such training. Both crews were on board on the same aircraft during the test flight. In accordance with the plan, they landed in Scotland and took the train to London. But in the capital, the British engineers contacted them with a request to show them the newest Soviet bomber. They got a corresponding permission. The flight to Dundee and back on the plane of the British Air Force should have taken just a few hours. Nobody wanted to leave London. The two friends, commanders Endel Pusep and Sergei Asimov, drew lots.
The lot fell on Asimov. Actually, Asimov headed the group of British experts. They went from London to Scotland, where later on our TV7 will land. And the trip turned into tragedy. There was a catastrophe. The engine got destroyed. Because of the engine failure, the fuel in the tank exploded. Only the fragments of the plane fell on Earth. Nobody had a parachute. Nobody survived. Asimov died during the flight. Afterwards, it was decided that Pusep would become a commander of the crew to take the delegation headed by Molotov to Great Britain and then to the United States.
Pusep was in the alternative reserve crew, but such a tragic accident made him the commander of the secret flight. Negotiations with Prime Minister Churchill prove rather complicated. Molotov insists on discussing the post-war boundaries. It's his mission entrusted by Stalin, but Churchill is unwilling to hurry. The issue of opening the second front gets stuck in numerous details and allusions. Molotov states that if the Allies involve at least from 30 to 40 German divisions in battles in Western Europe, the situation on the German-Soviet front will turn around. The defeat of Hitler will be guaranteed. Nevertheless, no legible agreement both on the boundaries and on the second front can still be reached. The British Prime Minister delays with the answer.
The second front has already been opened. You see, we fight in Africa. That's the second front. Americans are at war in the Pacific Ocean. That's the second front as well. So you understand it was just a verbal duel without any substantial ground.
On May 26, the parties signed the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of Alliance for 20 years. It's the biggest possible result. In irritation, Molotov sends a wire to the Kremlin. Apparently, there are no hopeful prospects in the USA either, but we still have to go there as promised. On May 27, the plane is ready for the next trip, and Pusip takes the command over the flight again. They are to make the most complicated part of the route across the Atlantic. Kokonaki was the only Soviet pilot to cover this distance at a time, but he set up this record in times of peace, and they can't afford to risk him. A refueling in Iceland is required on the way to Washington. Today, it only takes 10 hours to get to America by plane. Everybody can afford it and enjoy the warmth and comfort of the trip. It's now a usual practice that the leaders of the states fly on board their own planes with increased safety measures and comfort. Now, just imagine that there's nothing of that kind. In 1942, the members of the secret mission from the Kremlin compliantly sat on self-made benches. They had oxygen containers at their feet and compulsory masks on their faces.
The entrance was made from the cockpit. Bomb doors were closed tight. An additional compartment was created where they could take seats. Bomb doors in this type of aircraft are rather big, more than 1 meter in width.
It is terribly cold inside the plane. Even wearing flying jackets, they feel cold as if they were sitting in their underwear.
I'd like to make special mention of Molotov. He did so well. The wind blew from every slot, the air being 50 degrees below zero. In addition, this oxygen mask on his face. He also recollected that there was one really big inconvenience. The flight lasted rather long, especially to the United States. But bombers were not equipped with an elementary toilet. There was a bucket, which they had to use in freezing conditions, 50 degrees below zero.
An hours-long flight is a very hard work. Autopilots are not perfect. Thus, the pilot can't take his hands off the control wheel even for a minute. Fatigue is so strong that the plane seems to stand still. In 1976, Endel Pusip shared his memoirs about the trip.
For its time, it was an extraordinary flight. Out of all the Soviet pilots, only Kokonaki had crossed the ocean in a one-way trip, and no one had ever performed a return flight.
Many pilots dreamed of crossing the ocean, reaching America and establishing a new record in the distance of the flight. They trained for months. The year 1937 was marked with multiple records for the USSR. In June, Chkalov, Beyudikov, and Belyakov for the first time performed a flight from Moscow to Vancouver over the North Pole. In July, a new record in distance was set by the Gromov's crew. Sigismund Levanevsky was the third to make a non-stop flight to America. In August 1937, multiple cameras saw him off from a non-stop flight from Moscow to the North Pole to the USA. The place of the crashed Levanevsky's plane will never be found. But the best pilots from flight schools will be sent that year to the Arctic. Endel Pusip, the senior instructor of the Naval Pilots School in Yeysk, will be among them.
The failure of that expedition produced quite the opposite impression on me. Although people died and planes crashed, people had to spend weeks and months there, freezing and sometimes starving. However, there was something so irresistible there that I couldn't help coming back.
Only years after will Pusip understand this symbolic coincidence. He came to the Arctic to search for a man who didn't make it to America. Many years will pass before he gets to know that his Arctic trip had one more hidden cause. Here are the pages from his unpublished manuscript. We showed them for the first time. Pusip writes, "I didn't realize that my stay in the guest-friendly Arctic saved me from sharing the destiny of thousands of other people in those scary times. In 1937, the friends of Pusip fought for his departure to the north. They wanted to save the non-party instructor with non-Russian surname from imminent arrest."
It's amazing that afterwards he was entrusted with the mission to deliver Molotov to his place of destination.
They landed at Reykjavik Airport for refueling and got stuck. Weather conditions have been really bad for 3 days already. There are wind and fog over the ocean. It's a common thing for polar latitudes. Coffee, whiskey, and American love songs are the main entertainment of local pilots under non-flying weather. We feel bored, Pusip writes in his diary. When at last the weather conditions permit flying, Pusip gives a command to take off. The engines are warmed up, but suddenly it becomes dead calm. Taking off without any headwind is crazy. It's an enormous risk. There might be lack of the lifting force. The takeoff runway of the airfield in Iceland is too short for the heavy Soviet bomber. But Molotov is getting nervous. Time is flying, and Pusip makes a decision to take off.
That runway just didn't end. It ended all of a sudden. It ended with a 10-meter steep over the sea, over the ocean to be more accurate. We said, "We have a full load of fuel. What shall we do?" He thought for a long time, and then he turned on the afterburner. Afterburning gives superpower revolutions in order to take off, to speed up the plane. He managed it, but he felt that he wouldn't be able to take off.
Sears off, stand paralyzed with terror. The Russian plane falls down the steep and heads to the ocean.
He doesn't write about this in his book, but we know this story from the crew. They were shocked and sat still in silence for a while, trying to calm down. Molotov knew nothing about the situation for sure. But this event could become a fatal one.
These were the most dangerous minutes in all 25 days of the trip. They had one chance in 1,000 to take off, and they didn't miss it. Less than a day is left before the arrival of the Soviet military plane to the capital of the United States. The White House is actively keeping correspondence with Downing Street. President Roosevelt sends an inquiry to London. Please inform urgently how Molotov conducted the negotiations. It was a matter of war and peace on Earth, and it was the matter of life and death in the air. From Iceland to North America, they fly over the narrowest part of the Atlantic Ocean, along the nearest route to Canada. Still, these are 3,000 kilometers of nothing but water, and the commander prays for only one thing, for the engines to sustain the flight. The heavy, multi-layered clouds surround them already for several hours. Pusip switches to blind flying. There's such a term in aviation, blind or instrument flying. That is, flying under complicated conditions, in the fog, in the clouds, at night, without visual reference, when all hopes are put upon cockpit indicators and the pilot's intuition and skills. Nowadays, blind flying is still taught in flight schools. But today, pilots also have high-precision equipment and air traffic control assistance. But before World War II, blind flying was also taught at a number of flight schools, first on Earth and then in the air.
There was the device called blind flying hood. I put it on and see nothing but the cockpit panel. Back in 1942, we were taught with the help of this hood to fly on instruments and at night, so we felt quite comfortable in the clouds.
Pusip learned blind flying on U-2 in Orenburg. Later on, he flew in a covered cabin across the whole country, from the Azov Sea to Moscow and back. Not everybody could cope with such training, but he seemed to feel that this experience would, time and again, save his life. It's the 12th day of the secret trip. The destination, the airport of Washington, is nearer and nearer, but heavy clouds pin the plane down to the ground. The huge bomber, with red stars on its wings, flies over roofs of the houses. They dive into the thick air of American summer. The temperature inside the aircraft reaches 35 degrees. The engines are overheated, and it's getting dangerous.
They cracked, and they were covered with oil. We had to turn one engine off not to burn ignition plugs completely. Then we lowered the capacity of the second engine and flew on 2.5 engines. We were happy just like children when at last we saw the runway of Washington Airfield.
Still, it wasn't the end of the trials. Landing is rather tough. Abrupt deceleration causes explosion of the landing gear tire. Anyway, it doesn't matter anymore. They've reached their destination. They've never been taken so many pictures. Actually, they have gotten used to the increased attention on the side of Allies during the trip. But the pilots are exhausted by such a long flight. They can't even enjoy Washington with its peaceful and settled May life. The crew goes to the hotel. Pusip writes in his diary, "I was so tired, I slept for 16 hours." Roosevelt receives Molotov immediately. To save time, the People's Commissar is accommodated right at the White House. For the first time in the history of the Soviet-American relations, a statesman of such high level visited Washington.
I have a picture of these negotiations between Roosevelt and Molotov in the so-called map room, a room with the maps in the White House. They're looking at each other and smiling. On the reverse side of the picture, there's an inscription made by the hand of Roosevelt to my friend Molotov. These were really constructive negotiations.
On the next day, Roosevelt expressed a wish to meet in person with the crew of the Soviet military plane which had crossed the ocean. Pusip at once recognized the man sitting in a big leather armchair. "Thanks to you, I had a pleasure of talking to such a wonderful man as Mr. Molotov," the president said. "Please bring him here more often." Pusip just smiled in reply. The official negotiations at the White House ended on June 1st. Both parties signed a communiqué which indicated the year 1942 as the year of the Second Front opening.
It was a tremendous diplomatic success, an enormous diplomatic breakthrough. After that, having secured the support of Roosevelt, the Soviet authorities could continue negotiations with Churchill.
The Information Bureau detailed summary of those days does not reach the delegation, but they know that severe battles are conducted for Sevastopol, Belgorod, and Voronezh. These armies are surrounded by the enemy near Kharkov. Our troops have to retreat. Losses are huge. Never in this war, neither before nor after that, was the consecration of the enemy's force at the front as big as in summer 1942. Stalin telegraphs to Molotov, "We should put some pressure on Churchill to organize the Second Front and put it into action this year. It means they have to fly to London again." The representatives of the State Department and omnipresent journalists came to see Molotov off at the airfield. Pusip looks at his watch. It's time to leave. Navigators lay a familiar route: Canada, Iceland, Scotland. They will be the first Soviet pilots to cross the ocean and make a return flight. The second meeting in London brings good results. Now Molotov is supported by the agreement with Roosevelt. It's his new trump card in the diplomatic game he plays with the British Premier. Finally, Churchill agrees with the proposal of the Kremlin. The agreement with Great Britain and the United States on the urgent tasks of opening the Second Front in Europe was reached in 1942. The mission entrusted by Stalin was fulfilled.
Of course, our country had to wait for the opening of the Second Front till the middle of 1944. Surely it complicated the conduct of operations for us. It caused tremendous losses for our nation. Nevertheless, if not this Pusip's flight with Molotov to Great Britain and the United States happened, the Second Front might have not been opened even in 1944.
Before his departure to Moscow, Molotov was invited by His Majesty, King George XI. Commander Pusip and his crew were introduced to the Crown Princess, future Queen Elizabeth. The British offered them to fly to Moscow over Africa and the mountains of Iran. Their cautions made sense. Reconnaissance reported that Berlin already knew about the negotiations between the Allies. The chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, ordered by any means to detect, shoot down, or capture the plane with the People's Commissar of the USSR on board. The day before the departure from London, Molotov unexpectedly sent for Pusip. Their evening talk was only fixed in the mayor's diary. Molotov handed Pusip a file of documents. "Here are the results of our journey. Do you think we should publish them a day early, before coming back to Moscow?" Pusip understood that the People's Commissar was right. They really needed to mislead German reconnaissance. The threat of tomorrow encountered with German fighters in the sky was quite realistic. Only the publication of the treaty, for which sake they had committed that risky flight, could save them. The plane was just heading to the runway when the Pravda newspaper with the text of the communique was passed for press. It took them 5 endless hours to reach the Soviet territory. The gunners were ready to shoot at any moment. They were always alert to face the enemy's attack. Only after the plane had crossed the front line, Pusip realized that their plan had worked. No one looked for them. On June 12th, 25 days after the start of the trip, the TB-7 successfully landed at the central airfield of Moscow. Later on, Pusip counted the hours spent in flight, 55 hours. His friends noticed first gray hairs, which had appeared on his temples. Molotov hugged the commander. "Thank you for the nice trip." Pusip wrote a short note in his diary. "I want to sing out loud."
Molotov considered him a very talented aviator. He realized that he owed not only his diplomatic success, but also his life to that man. I was told that after Molotov had come back to Moscow, he had been for a long time talking not about Roosevelt or Churchill, not about Great Britain or the United States, but about the flight. It produced such a powerful impression on him.
In accordance with the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, Mayor Asyamov, posthumously, Mayors Pusip, Romanov, and Stepenko were awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union for successful fulfillment of the governmental mission. Since October 1942 and till the end of the war, Colonel Endel Pusip had been in charge of the Long-Range Air Regiment No. 890, which was also called the Bryansky Regiment. He had seen the Victory Day together with his regiment. In 1946, Colonel Pusip left his regiment forever. He retired from the Air Force. He was 37.
After the war, dozens of thousands of ace pilots, bombers, fighters, and attack pilots found themselves useless in times of peace. Many of them never found themselves in this new life. For Pusip, his retirement meant a successful completion of his career.
Post-war Estonia gathered national staff all over the Soviet Union. Endel Pusip was invited to Tallinn as well. He became the Minister of Social Insurance and Vice Chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Estonian SSR and worked at the Central Committee of the Republic. For many years, he locked inside a wardrobe his past and his outstanding flight records together with his uniform, coat, and military awards. For those people who came to his office, he was just a civil person, an ordinary Soviet official.
There was such an occasion. One military man applied for something that Pusip couldn't give. The man flew into a rage and started accusing the official. "You swivel chair warrior, you stayed at the rearward while we were fighting and dying for you," and so on. The applicant lost self-control and seized an ink pot from the table. There were no ballpoint pens at those times, and flung it at Pusip. He said he had managed to evade the blow.
After that, Pusip started wearing his well-deserved gold star of the Hero of the Soviet Union on his jacket. Not to boast of it, but to protect himself from idiots. In 1973, Endel Pusip retired. He took his dusty military diaries and started writing a book, where for the first time in history, he shared his memoirs of a witness of the once secret journey over the ocean. In the beginning of the 1990s, things mixed up. Estonia was thriving for independence. It was difficult for Endel Pusip, as for many elderly people in our country, to understand what was happening. Pusip, as an ethical historian, had no right to live in the newly independent country. He was incredibly tolerant. But for the first time in his life, he became aware of a terrific thing. He realized that he should have died earlier. He lived for 5 years more, and these years were the worst years of his life. New money became a disaster for his family. Rubles were taken out of circulation. Their savings lost their value, and his ministerial pension turned miserable.
Their situation was very bad. Suddenly, I got to know that there was a military enlistment office there, and military men received a decent pension. I said, Endel Karlovic, you can get a military pension at the military enlistment office. And he answered, who will give me this military pension? The officer said, okay, just bring the papers.
Still, the Ministry of Defense of Russia can do nothing about the restitution. One day, a former owner came to Pusip's house. Endel Pusip was granted the right to live there in 1961. He got that accommodation as many people did in those times. The state provided the authorization. The house was under construction and empty. The Agency for Combating the Theft of Socialist Property and Speculation had seized it for the benefit of the state from a citizen because of his accusation in bribery or theft. Pusip had nothing to do with those legal proceedings. But then, as in a bad dream, the former owner was standing at the doorsteps of his house and demanding to return his property seized by communists.
Endel understood the situation. He agreed to leave the apartment. He just asked to give him a little time to write to municipal authorities in order to get a new accommodation, and then he would leave at once.
He started bringing in his furniture. It was scary. We found ourselves in complete desperation and uncertainty.
The old man had nowhere to go, just literally to the streets. His military awards could not protect him anymore. His contribution to the victory was then deemed as rather an aggravating circumstance.
We can't just cut out part of our common history, paint it black, throw it away and say, it's your history, not ours. Our history is as white as snow, delicious and nice, and we always fought for it.
A director of a big plant helped the war veteran. Despite all new laws, he gave Pusip an apartment in a new house in the suburbs of Tallinn. I don't care what they say, the director snapped out. The old laws granted assistance to the heroes.
When he felt bad, he didn't want to see anybody at all. In one of his diaries, I read that Estonia had met him as a mother, but had seen him off as a stepmother.
The Ministry of Defense of Russia paid for both the funeral and the tomb, and the tombstone of the hero of the Soviet Union. Still, the gold star was not found before the funeral. The family members think that he sold it in order to survive in the beginning of the 1990s.